in from the waiting room. We're excited to have you join us for another lunch and learn session together. Before we hear from Dr. Subramanian, who's going to tell us what we're learning about and who our guest is today, I'll cover a couple housekeeping options. Your chat button is going to be your communication line to us. So I always like to hear where everyone's tuning in from. It's a good way to practice using the chat. So if you could click on that, it's in the bottom middle of your screen, and tell us where you're joining from. What city, town, country, even, if you're one of our international guests. Would love to hear that. Second thing, I want to make sure we heard your feedback that with a lot of these topics, it would help to have subtitles or captions and be able to both read the words and hear what the doctors are speaking about. So we've enabled that function in Zoom. You can turn it off or you can turn it on. At the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says live transcript and it has CC. If you click on that, you can choose the options. So you can either have it on the screen or you can have a running transcript on the side. So click around there, play with that. We want to make sure that you're getting this great information as many different ways and however you like to receive information. So that takes care of all the housekeeping. So again, I'm Andrea from PMD Alliance. We're so glad to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Subramanian.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for continuing to host PMD Alliance and for us, unfortunately, still being physically distanced, but socially connecting in this way. It's been a great platform to host a variety of cool topics. And we've just been kind of going down some explorations as to what 2021 is holding. And I think it's been exciting for me to be able to connect with some new folks that I haven't really worked very closely with. And Dr. Mari, who I'm going to introduce to you in a second, is one of those people. We're working on a cool new project around mental health and wellness and sort of supporting our patients, meeting them where they are and in the world, wherever they are, with a kind of a new platform that we're working with a group of collaborators around the world to sort of bring you some cool new options. So wanted to introduce Zoltan, who's become a friend over the last several months. We've shared some conversations around our shared interests in, caring about Parkinson's patients and thinking about out-of-the-box solutions for the things that they're dealing with. And so it's with great pleasure that I bring you Dr. Mari, who has had an interesting path, actually, and he'll tell us a little bit about it. He is originally from Hungary and then ended up at Sunny Downstate, trained, did his residency there, ended up then at Johns Hopkins and is now at the Lou Rubo, just the neighboring state away from me in Las Vegas, and has an affiliation with the Cleveland Clinic and is on faculty at the Cleveland Clinic, working with some of our colleagues there too. So Dr. Mari has been really interested in a number of things, but one of the things that he's really a world leader in is technology. And so I asked him to share a little bit about the cutting edge sort of thoughts about technology and how it might help. Sometimes it can hinder us with some of our wellness, as we've talked about, trying to minimize screen time and trying to, sort of unplug sometimes, but sometimes it can actually help us a lot in sort of looking at things like, trying to be compliant with medication sometimes or exercise regimens and things like that. So hopefully we can learn from Dr. Mari today about a number of these sorts of new things. And as doctors, we can also sometimes use technology to help reach out to our patients, as we've been doing in the last year, as well as possibly track symptoms. So love to sort of find out a little bit about Zoltan, your journey, how you got inspired to be a neurologist and care of Parkinson's patients, and maybe tell us a little bit more about the Lou Rubo Center where you work and its affiliation with the Cleveland Clinic, because they're not really exactly in the same place at all. So maybe tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll hear more about the technology after we hear about this.
Thank you so much, Indu, and I wanted to thank you and the PMD Alliance for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to share some of my passion around technology and monitoring. And there's a buzzword that I used here, the digital phenotyping around that. And by the way, I totally thought before that our friendship goes well beyond the past few months, but it's it's always a good way to connect and work together. And as you mentioned, we have this wonderful collaboration. Mainly built on wellness, and I would like to make a case how monitoring and some of the technology that we have can enhance the focus on individual needs of patients and support our understanding of how their life is and what questions and problems they may have. And certainly the one size fits all does not apply in Parkinson's disease. And sometimes when we talk about technology and monitoring techniques and how we collect data, it can feel like there's a abundance of data that will draw on us. It will be just too much to handle. But if we make sense of it, it does have the potential of understanding patients' problems in a much more granular way, in a much more individualized way. So my talk, I hope I can show you how is very consistent with the initiative that Indu described, and we are all engaged with around wellness and mental health and well-being of patients. Now, as far as how I ended up with Parkinson's disease, it's a really long story, and I will have to go through my slides real quick, which I didn't initially prepare with slides. When we had the initial conversation, we were going to have just an interactive discussion around the topic, which I can also do, but I do have slides, and if I go through them too fast, that's because of the interest of time. But at the same time, I already agreed to share them with all of you, so you can always review the slides later if we don't have time to cover every single piece of information. I have 55 slides, so that would well be enough for a whole hour. And again, I will not go through all of them in great detail. So the story how I ended up with Parkinson's disease actually goes back to the time when I was 3 years old. I wanted to be a biologist. The first thing that everybody asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said I was going to be a biologist. When I was a little bit older, then my parents said that that's not what they thought was going to be the best for me. I come from a multi-generation family of dentists, so they said that I had to be a dentist, which I had zero interest in. And so we made a compromise. I went to general medicine. I didn't go to become a biologist. My mom said that she didn't hope that I would be washing test tubes for the rest of my life. That was her concept of being a biologist. But anyway, so I already knew that in general medicine I could do research because I knew people at the medical school. So as soon as I became a medical student, I started an undergrad research lab work, which involved rats that were used for Parkinson's disease modeling. These were 6-hydroxydopamine lesioned rats, and I developed a technique to create those rats. And because this project was related to Parkinson's disease modeling, it set me in that direction. And you mentioned that I was in Brooklyn. I started with a postdoc fellowship, which was working with primates, MPTP lesioned monkeys. So MPTP is a contaminant of synthetic narcotics that can cause a Parkinson-like state by lesioning or killing the nigrostriatal dopamine neurons. So I was involved with rhesus monkeys that had this toxin injected in one carotid, making them hemi-Parkinsonian. So they would have Parkinson symptoms on one side of their body, and the other side was normal for control. So I worked with that then, and I did my neurology residency. After which fellowship in movement disorders at the NIH in Bethesda. And once I have done with all those years of training, I ended up with my first real job at the Johns Hopkins University, where I ultimately was the director of the Parkinson and Movement Disorder Center, from where I was recruited with an endowment to be the endowed chair and director of the Parkinson Movement Disorder Program at the Louisville Center. And you mentioned that this is not exactly Ohio, but Cleveland Clinic does have many different campuses, I would say around the globe, because London, Abu Dhabi, and Toronto are some of our international campuses. And then there are domestic ones. There's Weston, Florida, Cleveland Clinic, and there are several in Ohio. So we are the one representing the West Coast. And of course, our center is very small, and it only does neurology. And even within neurology, we only have 3 subspecialties at the moment. And those include Alzheimer's and dementia, which is our largest profile, MS and neuroimmunology. And then the third one, which I am leading, is the Parkinson's and movement disorder.
Okay.
So that's where I'm at, and you can see I'm gonna share my screen if that's okay, to show you
Yeah.
mm, our center looks like this, and those are some of my titles. This is not where we see patients. This is our event center, and we hold events there, educational events. So hopefully, when this pandemic is fully over, we can resume our educational symposia, which have always been quite popular, and we hope to have a hybrid system moving forward. Behind the building that's on the picture, there is also 2 or 3 additional smaller buildings, and those are used for our multidisciplinary team members. We have physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, clinical mental health counseling. We have neuropsychology and neuropsychiatry, and we also have an imaging center to provide all the services that a fully equipped multi-specialty center should have. We do have a center of excellence designation from the Parkinson's Foundation, which we hold in combination with our Ohio main campus Cleveland Clinic, and I am co-director of the Parkinson's Foundation Center of Excellence with Dr. Hubert Fernandez, who is at our main campus in Ohio. So again, today's topic is objective measurements and digital phenotyping. When we talk about phenotyping, that's a word that describes what we can learn about certain features of the patients, how they look, how they behave. And digital phenotyping is sort of this new buzzword whereby we use modern technology to learn more about certain symptoms of the patient. Now, these are some of my disclosures, and I wanted to start pointing out that we have introduced this idea of digital phenotyping not too long ago in a paper that was published less than a year ago in the Parkinsonism and Related Disorders journal. And this is a figure from that publication. And this is just one way of describing that there is a gap between what seems to be important to patients, what they cite as they would want to let their physicians and providers monitor. At the same time, there is another set of symptoms that physicians will note as important. So there's a gap there, and I would like to show you a smaller study. These are screenshots that I took from Bass Bloem's Movement Disorder Society presentation last year. So don't report me to the Movement Disorder Society, but Bass gives his approval. So anyway, I would like to show you this slide where you see a list of symptoms worth monitoring as listed by patients and as listed by professionals. And you can see that on the top, which is the patient reported list, you see things like difficulty concentrating or staying focused. And here in the United States, we would use a single S. This is again from Europe. Pain, finding it difficult to stay awake. Those are decidedly around non-motor, maybe neuropsychiatric issues, and mentioned more by professionals, things like walking, slowness of movement, and balance. This is another question on the same survey that Dr. Bas Bloem did in Holland, which is you have to list factors that are influencing PD. And you can see that mentioned more by patients include stress and sleep on the top. And other than well-being, which is on the bottom of the chart, most of them are like medications, exercise. So there is a disconnect, and I think we should do a better job to sort of narrow or close that that gap. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic, or a year into a pandemic, and that raises the stakes and the focus on remote care. Now, of course, there have been a lot of barriers and inadequate or unavailable technologies, other barriers, including reimbursement issues, which are particularly limiting in the United States, or were limiting before the CARES Act. And I think the silver lining, as much as the pandemic has been terrible, that a lot of attention to these barriers came about, and then they came to the front and center, and that I think helped make some adoption. We are not going to address telemedicine. I know that there was another presentation about telemedicine before, and of course telemedicine and remote measurements and objective and digital monitoring are very related, because telemedicine is not just virtual visits or FaceTime or video visits. Telemedicine and telehealth include many other modalities that would be inclusive of remote monitoring. This is just a survey that we did for the Movement Disorder Society, and there's Bass over there. So the Movement Disorder Society, which is a professional society, has a telemedicine study group, which I am currently the chair of. Anyway, I mentioned earlier that one concern about all of this, wearables, cell phone based apps that you can use to fill out how you feel, or use the cell phone to walk and measure your get up and walk and turn times, and many other parameters. So all of these and sometimes video cameras that are installed in your home that will monitor as to how much time it takes for you to complete breakfast and go around the table and other things. So all of these continuously available monitoring options will generate a lot of data. And one of the major challenges is what to do with so-called big data, whereby we generate and collect just about anything and everything about you. What does that mean? How can we turn that into actionable information? And one thing that you might have heard before in criticizing some of the objective data measures is, how is it validated? Is it not validated? And some of the clinical clinician performed tests, such as the Unified Parkinson Disease Rating Scale, are said to be the gold standard and validated. So I just wanted to mention a few important studies. The At-Home PD is exploring that validation challenge. Watch PD. I certainly want to mention this. This is probably the most relevant scientist designed study that aims to provide that validation. So it is a validation study specifically for these some of these Apple Watch and other measures. The Watch PD is the primary principal investigator is Dr. Ray Dorsey, and what sets the Watch PD apart from every other related technology validation studies that there have been many is that industry and the industry perspective or goals or marketing considerations were not included in the study design. In other words, many of the previous studies on technological measurements and wearables and other technologies were sponsored by the makers of those particular devices. And obviously, when it's sponsored by the maker of the device, they want to see some sort of results that will translate into, you know, marketing, tangible marketing value. And that doesn't always align with what is most scientifically rigorous and what's needed most for our understanding of Parkinson's disease and these devices. So that's why I wanted to spend a little time in singling out the Watch PD study, because it was entirely designed by scientists such as Dr. Dorsey or myself, and only with one thing in mind, that provide the most high quality and well-designed study in order to accomplish validation of certain important wearable sensors and devices. Um, so I mentioned the UPDRS, and as I said, I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides here, um, but it is still a gold standard that you cannot avoid in clinical trials as an endpoint, as well as oftentimes used in clinical care as to sort of have an idea how severe the Parkinson symptoms are. And when I talk about the UPDRS, I would like to mention that it has several parts, and not all the parts are, you know, worth criticizing as much as the other parts. So part 3 is the motor exam. It is the one where we ask patients to tap their fingers, move their hands, and then we assign a score between 0 and 4 for each of those several items. And it is a very arbitrary scoring. Some could ask, why not do 0 to 10, or uh, why how to tell three from four, and there's a lot of subjectivity and arbitrariness, but also it is ecologically invalid, because we do this usually in a point where the patient is not like working with their activities of daily living or tasks that matter to their happiness, function, and quality of life, but they are just doing a test that is artificially created, usually in the office, which is not their home, and it's a spot test, so it could vary greatly. So there are many limitations of this, and this is the gold standard. So I'm not going to go through the details of what's wrong with that. Rather, moving to a new model in which we hope to accomplish data collection in the patient's home, which is ecologically valid, where they live, where their functions, their motor symptoms, and all what they do actually matters, because it is their normal home environment. And then we hope to collect data about tangible performance, well-being, and other parameters and domains, and then it is being stored and analyzed and processed, and ultimately turned into some form of actionable information that tells us how that particular patient feels, how they need to perhaps change their treatments. So this is the idea that could be quite well customized and individualized if we understand exactly what these data mean. So this is a technology that I wanted to mention that I'm particularly excited about, and I have a conflict because I'm a medical advisor for the company that makes this so-called NeuroQWERTY technology available. It's not FDA approved yet. It's in a testing phase, but the idea is that it tracks a typing behavior. Each of us type differently, and if you analyze our typing, there comes a signature which is quite unique, almost like our fingerprint, because there's a particular way that we do the flight from one key to the other, use the space, how long we press it down, how often we use the backspace. And there are many other things that can be molded into a complex profile of typing behavior. And then this can be monitored over time. And it can be used for marking certain changes, such as progression or when a treatment is started. But it can also be used potentially, and it hasn't been fully tested in that regard. It's underway. For instance, to identify the so-called phenoconversion. We are very interested in certain states that we refer to as prodromal states that precede Parkinson's disease, and will eventually progress into Parkinson's disease in a very high percentage. But when and which ones won't convert remains somewhat uncertain. And these are states such as loss of sense of smell, anosmia, or REM behavior disorder, RBD, or certain genetic mutations that correlate with Parkinson risk genes. So these patients will eventually develop motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease, or a good proportion of them will. But before that happens, it may be possible to tell that something is underway. And the reason why that would be profound is because if and when we will have disease modifying or preventative treatments, you don't want to use that in somebody who will not convert, but you want to use it as soon as you know that somebody is more likely to convert. And of course, there are other technologies that can confirm, such as a DET scan or PET scan, if a phenoconversion event is being suspected. So anyway, the NQ is one very interesting technology in this space, and I would like to mention another company, and I don't have a relationship with them currently, so that I don't have a substantial conflict with them, and that is Great Lakes Neurotechnology. And so Great Lakes Neurotechnology is a company that's specializing in developing various devices. Some of them are wearable, some of them are ambulatory, and some of them you have to sit down and do a test. And this is the Kinesia device family. And what they have shown, and some of them do have an FDA clearance. What they have shown is that they provide a much more reliable, much more reproducible, and much more granular and scalable way of measuring some of the cardinal motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease, such as bradykinesia. And that's very important when you think about the what I mentioned about the 0 to 4 scaling in the gold standard UPDRS motor exam items. With some of these technologies, you don't have to force somebody's performance to a 1 or a 2, because it could be 1.78. And not only that, it can be a 1.78, but it could be actually very valid at 1.78. So for instance, with the UPDRS, which is the gold standard when we look at patients, how they perform certain motor tasks, and we force it to a 1 or 2, depending on our judgment, which is subjective. Now, if we are going to do the same test again later, we might not say the same score. And that's something that we can quantify. It's called intra-rater reliability. Or if Dr. Subramanian and I looked at 10 videos of patients performing the UPDRS, and we were asked to do the scoring, I can bet you that she would score some of the items higher than I do, because I'm a chronic underrater, I'm told. But the bottom line is that there is also an inter-rater reliability matter, not with technology. When you do technology, there is no rater. It is an objective measure. It's a physical metric that is measured by a machine. So the intra-rater and inter-rater questions that apply to a physical exam don't apply at all. And so that's one advantage of these technologies. And while we were talking about clinical care, it also very much applies to clinical research. We all want to develop better treatments, better symptomatic treatments, and especially disease-modifying treatments. And our clinical trials also struggle with the inaccuracy, the inter-rater reliability matters that affect our endpoints in those clinical trials. If our endpoints, if our outcome measures in those clinical trials could become much more accurate, much more reproducible, much more granular, then we could get away with fewer patients enrolled in the clinical trial and shorter time to put them through clinical trials, which would translate into using the same amount of money that we now have for clinical research to be testing far more drugs, and that would increase the yield of our finding better drugs and better treatments, but also accelerate the process of finding better treatments. And so that would be something that would be very relevant for clinical trial impact. And Dr. Okun was leading the effort a few years ago that actually quantified as to how much benefit we would have if we were able to move our primary outcome measures in Parkinson's disease clinical trials from clinician performed ones to machine and objective measurements. So there is no shortage of these, and I don't want to confuse you with all the technologies. Many of these companies come out with all sorts of technologies, and historically, they have focused on trying to fit the patients to what technology they have, rather than the other way around. That trend has changed, I should say, for the better. And I am working with a number of different companies that truly want to have a good device that's meaningful and helpful for the patients and the clinicians. And one of the clinical trials I mentioned, the WatchPD, is certainly in that direction. And there is another company in Israel, Mantfort, that developed a technology called Encephalog, or it's a phone app-based system of various testing, which can not only measure motor functions and speed and walking and tremor and all those kind of things, but there are very comprehensive self questionnaires for patients that speak to their well-being and help us understand what matters to them. And so that comes to the point I made in the starting slides, where we have a disconnect between what clinicians think that we should be measuring and what patients would like to report and what they feel like being important for their purposes. Anyway, I'm gonna skip those slides so that we have enough time for discussions. So as I mentioned, there are many of these different techniques that offer various aspects of remote monitoring and digital phenotyping and objective measurements. I wanted to maybe mention the personal kinetograph, or PKG. This is a system that has been patented, developed, and is distributed by an Australian company called Global Kinetics Corporation. And again, I'm conflicted there because I work with them as an advisor as well. This is, as I mentioned, FDA cleared, and it is a very good way of tracking one's average bradykinesia, or how slow they move, and also dyskinesia, how much of these extra levodopa-induced abnormal involuntary movements they have. It also measures tremor, and they are moving to improve this device to track sleep and other parameters in the non-motor domain. And right now, the best use of this device is to understand a patient's motor fluctuations, wearing off, dyskinesias, and how much of a response they have to their medications. What you can see here is their day and the average of their dyskinesia severity, the bradykinesia severity. Going down is worse bradykinesia. When they take the medication is a red vertical line here at about 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. and then 3 p.m. and then 7 p.m. And then you can see these dots of the acknowledgements of medication administration, which they do on the watch, so that we can monitor their compliance, but also how they respond to these doses. As you can see, the bradykinesia going up is reduction. More bradykinesia, higher score is down, and better or less bradykinesia is up. So that's confusing. But the bottom line is that the medication timing will nicely correlate with a surge in the bradykinesia curve, which means less bradykinesia or symptomatic response. So anyway, I'm not going to spend more time on the PKG. There are many other publications that support its values. And here's the kinesia device that I mentioned is coming from global, Great Lakes Technology. It can aid DBS programming, which is a very interesting concept. When we are doing DBS programming, that's deep brain stimulation surgery, where we have these implants in patients, and we want to determine if we make a setting change, does that translate in improvement in the symptoms? And we try to do that in the office setting, where the patient is sitting there and we are programming the DBS IPG in real time. And then it could be very difficult to, again, it's a subjective judgment. Is the speed better? Is the rigidity improved? Worse? So instead of all that decisions and measurements, it can be done by the machine. And it was shown in this particular study that when it is done by the machine, and that's what's driving the setting changes in the DBS, then the results are better. So the overall improvement in the symptoms is better, and it can be done in a faster or shorter amount of time. Voice is being analyzed. I mentioned DBS. It is now being tested for remote adjustments, and also based on some feedback. Um, there are many other diseases where remote monitoring is part of the clinical practice far more than it is in Parkinson's disease. So we hope to learn from other diseases as to how we can improve our ability to learn more and more and tangible information about patients' functions and well-being remotely through various sensors. So anyway, I think it's almost 40, and I just wanted to mention that this is a very active field where we are trying to convince the old school guys that remote measurements and technology and objective tracking is the way to go. It's just a question of time, and we can produce better results with these technologies than many of the old school in-clinic clinician performed exam-based methods. So I know that I rushed the slides a little bit, but I did say that in the beginning that I would, and I'm happy to share them later for your review. And I think it's better for the program if we spend the rest of the time with questions and the interactive part.
Yeah, that's awesome. Wow, what an overview. So it looks like there's a lot of interesting developments in this field. If a patient, let's say, wanted to keep up with this, what would be the best sort of resource, would you say, Zoltan, for kind of helping them to stay abreast? Because I always have patients who, they Google things and they bring me tons and tons of, stuff, and so much, looks like it's advertising from direct from companies. So is there a resource that you think is vetted that would be able to be a little bit more sort of, it sounds like, patient friendly and not maybe device company driven as much?
So a couple of comments on that. So excellent question. I have the same thing all the time. Patients bring all sorts of data, and just from Fitbit to everything, we have no shortage of commercially available tracking devices and all sorts of measurements. And then I don't want to sort of disappoint anyone to say that I don't know what to do with that data, and so you are right. It happens all the time, and so the best resource, I would say, because everybody is different, their needs may be different, their access to technology or clinical trials and other devices may be different. So I think it's a good starting point to talk to their movement disorder specialist and discuss what may be done. And as I mentioned, there are some of these which are readily available, even reimbursed by insurance and FDA cleared, that can certainly help in some cases, but not all cases. So it is the patient's actual symptoms and problems and stage of disease or the type of disability that they are experiencing, which will determine whether some of those already approved and commercially used Parkinson monitoring technologies apply or not. And I think that decision as to who's a good candidate for a PKG watch monitoring or who should get the kinesia device, etc., I think those decisions are probably best decided by their caring movement disorder specialist. Now, in a more general sense, if you want to track this and want to get good information, then first and foremost, I would recommend both the Michael J. Fox Foundation's pages as well as the Parkinson's Foundations. They both have regular updates related to these technologies, and I hope that we will, because there is a plethora of information out there that cannot be verified, that may not be helpful. And so this effort that you and I started, or you started, and I'm also part of, also aims to create reliable, dependable sources of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's needed across the board, right? Because I think, we were sort of trying to start this for wellness resources, because what ends up happening is the patient Googles something and then they end up getting referred to a stem cell.
Dr. Google. Yeah.
They end up getting referred to Taiwan for stem cell injections when they're trying to find a
It
medication.
happened to some of my patients. It didn't
So
go
I
well.
think vetting resources and finding, real solutions for our patients that can be translated relatively soon, I think, is what they're really hoping for, and some guidance. So I think that would be important. Robert's asking if you're aware of the New Touch digital app for the Apple Watch. Do you know much about that? I personally don't, but maybe you can comment on that.
So I'm not an Apple person, for that matter. I think it's in the right direction. I think it's helpful. I think it's contributing to a large database, and if Ray Dorsey is endorsing it and promoting it, or not promoting, but recommending it, I will take that. I mentioned this company, and I think I might be able to send the link that I think anyone can download, and I have really good um, good impression with what we have done. I'm going to send you the link here. Again, I don't have any relationship with this company, so I can share. I'm going to go to the chat, and so this is the encephalog that I mentioned, and what I like about it is its versatility, because it does have the ability to track motor or non-motor issues, different kind of motor issues, tremor. They have preformed menus that apply to, for instance, the generic Parkinson's or generic essential tremor. But then you can also update it with a la carte options of somebody who has MCI, then they could have a little bit stronger cognitive profile and build it that way. So I think we are. So I personally am not involved in terms of paid consulting or anything with them, but I'm also co-chair of the Parkinson's Study Group's motor working group, and in such we are working with this company to incorporate some of their work into our into the clinical trials in the United States, phase 3, that the Parkinson's Study Group is involved.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of adding non-motor and, sort of these more subjective sort of, feeling well, or, these different, maybe happiness, I don't know, different things that might be outside of tremor. Because I think, we do some studies on quality of life measures, and often they don't correlate with, the motor measurements. And so I think having the ability to track things, and I think having also the ability to have ways to help you comply as well is exciting to me, at least from some of these technologies. So, it's always interesting to see when patients say that they're taking their pills on time, and then they can actually see by, you showed the PKG graph there, you could see sort of, I guess you can actually see when they're physically look like they're moving to take the pill. Is that, or are they recording it somehow? How does that work on the PKG?
So it's a good point. So these different devices, because I oftentimes I'm asked the question as to which one is the best or which one will take over, and the answer is none of them, because they all contribute differently to our knowledge. So the PKG in particular is very good in understanding what happens to the motor function throughout the day. So the way it works is that the patient wears a watch which has motion sensors, gyroscope, accelerometers, and basically it tracks the movement. It usually should be worn in the arm that is more affected by Parkinson's. Usually there's an asymmetry, and the algorithm takes care of the rest. So it detects when the arm is moving, and we'll use that time to measure the speed of movement. It establishes a baseline, and it will look at how that changes across the day. So when somebody is interested in understanding the motor fluctuations in particular, it is extremely valuable, because it does a very good job in differentiating between tremor and levodopa-induced dyskinesias. And many patients will just tell you in the clinic visit that they're just not doing well. When they take the levodopa, they feel worse, and you just kind of have a hard time reconciling that with what you know about how levodopa should work, or how they should sort of fluctuate or not. And this will correlate that subjective report and history provided by the patient with actual objective when they shake. Do they shake before or after or around they take the medication? How bad their dyskinesia gets? And certainly just telling apart tremor from dyskinesia is very helpful. So when that's the question, for instance, you are wondering if somebody is well balanced, or maybe at the point where they are fluctuating too much, and could be candidates for one of the advanced treatment options such as DBS or Duopa. And then this would be very helpful in confirming that they are in fact fluctuating a lot or little, or sometimes they say they are fluctuating. You look at the PKG record and they are just massively undertreated. And that's their main problem. They shake at times more than others, but there is no dyskinesia whatsoever, and they don't even reach the normal level for movement speed at any time. So they are just undertreated across the day. Now, other devices, so that this is best for intraday monitoring, especially fluctuations, or just confirming that somebody has a medication response in the first place. But then there are others that you track for a long time, like the typing measure I showed you, several months, on that scale, and how they change over a long period of time, which is good for phenoconversion. Or if there was like a DBS at a certain point in March 1st, you can see that compared to the previous 3 months, how they did in the next 3 months. So depending on, and I say that all these technologies are very interesting and promising, and depending on what your question is or what you are after, what you are trying to know about that patient, you may use one or a different one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Are you also interested in, like, I know that the Aura ring, for example, is talking about heart rate monitoring and sleep and things like that. Are you involved in any of those sorts of measurements with, it's called the Aura ring. Have you heard of it, Zoltan?
Which ring?
Aura, AURA, I think it is. It's a ring that apparently senses temperature and all kinds of different things. It's interesting. I know Dr. Mishley's been wearing one, and she was joking around with me that when she gets anxious, it looks like she's exercising. So it's actually pretty hilarious how it,
Well, exercise will also drive up your dyskinesia score. We
Yeah.
know that from the PKG.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of confounding variables, it sounds like. So in terms of your day-to-day practice, I know you're doing a lot of research in these areas. Is there a practical app or two or something that, or a Fitbit or anything? What do you actually use in your day-to-day practice for your patients?
Yes, this is a very good question. So I am primarily, out of these various ones that do have FDA clearance and they are part of our standard practice, anyone can use them. I probably use the PKG device the most. Even that I'm using very sparingly at the moment. I think with the sort of the reimbursement and regulatory part is kind of lagging. Again, with the CARES Act, as a result of the pandemic, I think we have seen an acceleration of that pace, but there is still, I would say, quite a bit of a barrier in terms of the adoption of these technologies for that. And I don't blame regulatory agencies and authorities for that, because they really want to make sure that it helps, and maybe more research is needed for that. But the PKG I do use in my everyday practice for that particular purpose. If I don't get a clear sense from the patient's history how they fluctuating, if they fluctuating, it could be very helpful, because some patients are more attentive and able to discern the various kinds of symptoms they have. Some of them may not be able to. And so that is one. And of course, if I'm considering them for advanced treatments, I usually get a PKG just to kind of document that they do have significant problems with fluctuations. Other than that, I don't really use any of those technologies currently in a routine practice. Um, I'm part of Watch PD. I'm part of several other studies that aim to validate these. Now, if a patient brings all sorts of data, and I have patients who are PhDs and physicists, and they have their own device, they have their own algorithm, and they want to discuss that, I will try to my best knowledge to discuss what the data may mean. But of course, we have to be cautious with those, because when something is not validated, then sometimes what you think is your intuitive sense could be wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes too much information, and patients then get obsessed about it, right? And you always know who the engineers are in your group, because you're like, you see the textbook of all the symptoms. And so I often will tell people like that to just fill out a motor diary, sometimes the old school pen and paper motor diary, where and we can link that, maybe Rebecca or Andrea, you can, because that's just, sort of looking at the 24-hour of the day and sort of trying to guide. But I think that the fact that, it can tell dyskinesia from tremor is quite exciting, because that is something that I think a lot of patients sometimes have a tough time figuring out. So that's good. Well, I think one of the thoughts here is that, the underserved areas, and I know, Zoltan, you and I have been talking about even underserved communities of patients that may not be able to physically come in to see us. And, is there a way to capture some of those, especially, from a, let's say, Black, Latinx communities that we aren't able to kind of engage in studies or even engage in treatment, maybe having some way to remotely treat them, perhaps mailing something to them so they can monitor things, and then adjusting things through telehealth may be an idea. I don't know. I know you and I have been spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to break down the barriers for these sorts of issues, because I think we both feel that
Absolutely. That's a
pretty
very,
difficult.
very important point also that comes up in telehealth. And as I mentioned, in some ways, remote monitoring and device-based measurements are considered to be part of telehealth. Um, how underserved communities will be affected by it? Will it bring, narrow the gap and bring access to cutting edge subspecialty care to those who don't currently have? Or is it going to widen the gap in which certain communities not having the knowledge, access to digital technologies will be left out of something that is available to others that are more affluent and live in areas where these things are readily available? And nobody has the final answer to that. We are all hoping that the accessibility of many of these options to receive the high level care that patients with Parkinson's disease need will make it easier, and it will expand access, and it will make it possible to for patients in anywhere, in any community or geographical region, to receive the care they need. But we need to be very sensitive to some of those concerns about access to digital technologies. And the only way that we can make sure that it is not going to widen the gap is programs specifically addressing those communities, and sort of making sure that we understand the problem and have solutions for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Zoltan. I misspoke about our friendship. It has been longer. We've shared some glasses of wine over, I think, 10 years, maybe even.
I would say so.
And
I would say
I'm
so.
missing, I meant to say that we've been collaborating more recently, but it's been a great friendship. And I've really enjoyed sharing the passion around, these unmet needs, because I think that I know that your family, you have, a big interest in some of these communities. I know your wife is Black, and she's doing work as a therapist for some of these communities. And it's been a passion of yours, having practiced in some of these different locations, from Brooklyn to, I know Hopkins is near and dear to your heart still, and even where you are now. So I look forward to collaborating with you on trying to find real solutions, and hopefully the technology will help us with that. I am hopeful that hopefully it won't get
At least we are aware of
Yes.
this potential problem, and
Yes.
this potential, and we should be prepared for it. And a lot of us thinking about remote health and telehealth and technologies are aware of it and working on addressing those potential downsides of this. And I really appreciate the invitation. I saw some of the comments. I didn't read them all, but some of the patients were my former patients. And
yeah, your old patients are saying hello to you in the chat. It seems
current.
to have connected a lot of people, and we have a lot of Canadians on the line here, and all kinds of groups. So we'll be hopeful. I appreciate the fact that you are there, kind of watching over all of these companies and making sure that there's not conflicts of interest, and that you're serving sort of the needs of the patient. I love, Zoltan, when we speak about sort of patient-centered approaches, sort of keeping especially the sort of quality of life things and what matters to the patient at the forefront, I think are things that we really share. And I think that, sort of hopeful about the technology and wanting to make it accessible to all, because we can't just have, I think one of the things that you and I have spoken about is not to just improve the care of the niche population that's already getting good care. It's really to disseminate resources, disseminate care, across the world, if we can, to all patients.
Absolutely. And so there are two things that I want to end with. Is one is that not so one size does not fit all, and having more knowledge, more information, more data about everyone will help us pick and choose the part of the data and the part of the information that is most relevant to that patient, their needs and their disabilities. And the other thing that you mentioned, I totally agree with, is that we really have to change our focus to understand what is relevant to the patient, what matters to them, rather than what we sort of understand about Parkinson's disease and what it should look like, you know.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for taking the time, Zoltan. I know you're extremely busy handling a lot of different things, so we really appreciate it. I'm going to hand it
Thank
back
you.
to Andrea to wave us out, and thanks PMD Alliance for hosting.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yes, Dr. Mar, we always end with a goodbye wave. So we use this technology after learning about all the tech. And you can scroll through and just see all the appreciative faces. We're so grateful for you. And thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for again,
Thank
for
you.
hosting and putting this
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye
guys.
now.
Thank you. Take care.